The good news is you've just time traveled to medieval Europe. Free lodging in a quaint thatched cottage, and all the authentic experiences a history buff could dream of. The bad news is you're a woman, and your life expectancy just plummeted faster than your Instagram follower count during a political rant. Welcome to the 13th century, where that master's in gender studies won't help you navigate the deeply entrenched patriarchal society you've just been dumped into. Hope you weren't too attached to voting rights, property ownership, or basic human dignity. Those won't be invented for another several centuries. First things first, forget that beauty sleep you're so fond of. You'll be up before the crack of dawn, probably around 4 a.m., because medieval life follows the sun's schedule, not your preferred brunch timing. That memory foam mattress you love? Replace it with a straw pallet likely infested with fleas, bedbugs, and possibly a family of mice. If you're lucky, you might have a wool blanket, though it's probably never been washed and smells like a combination of body odor, smoke, and whatever mysterious medieval funk permeated everything back then. And that's assuming you're not sharing your sleeping space with livestock, which was common for peasant families during winter months. Nothing says, good morning, like waking up to a chicken pecking at your face. Your morning skincare routine? Forget about it. That 12-step Korean beauty regimen with snail mucin and hyaluronic acid serums is being replaced with absolutely nothing. Or maybe, if you're feeling fancy, a splash of cold water from a bucket you share with the entire household. Toothpaste hasn't been invented yet, so your options are limited to rubbing your teeth with a cloth, maybe with some salt if you're wealthy enough to afford such luxuries. Bad breath was so common that nobody would notice yours. Small blessings. Some medieval beauty treatments did exist, though they might kill you faster than they'd improve your appearance. Ceruse, a white lead-based makeup, was popular among nobility for achieving that I'm slowly dying of lead-poisoning pallor that was all the rage. Nothing says beauty like neurological damage and infertility. Your wardrobe choices are equally thrilling. Forget about expressing your individuality through fashion. Your clothes are determined entirely by your social class, marital status, and local sumptuary laws that literally made it illegal for you to dress above your station. Hope you enjoy layers, because you'll be wearing many: a linen chemise, underwear, kirtle, dress, possibly a surcoat, overdress, an apron for work, and a wimple and veil to cover your scandalous hair. Yes, your hair was considered too tempting for men to resist, so better keep it hidden lest you cause them to sin with your provocative locks. These outfits weren't just restrictive in style. They were physically restrictive too. Everything was handmade, likely by you from scratch. No elastic, no zippers, just laces and pins that never quite stayed where they should. Breakfast time, but don't expect avocado toast or your pumpkin spice latte. Your morning meal, if you're lucky enough to have one at all, likely consists of a hunk of brown bread, complete with bits of millstone grit that will gradually wear down your teeth, and perhaps some ale. Yes, ale for breakfast, because the water might kill you. Medieval alehouses were often run by women, one of the few businesses you could operate as a female. These alewives were so common that they became associated with witches in popular imagery. The tall pointy hat was actually to help customers spot them in the marketplace, and the cat and cauldron were tools of the brewing trade. The connection between women brewers and witchcraft wasn't a coincidence. As brewing became more profitable, men pushed women out of the trade, often using accusations of witchcraft as a convenient way to eliminate female competition. Now that you're fed and dressed, it's time for your daily chores. If you thought being a modern working mom was tough, medieval women essentially worked 3 full-time jobs: household management, child rearing, and contributing to the family trade or agricultural work. Laundry alone would take an entire day: heating water, making lye soap from ashes and animal fat, scrubbing everything by hand, then hanging it to dry. Food preparation was equally labor-intensive. Forget microwave meals. You're grinding your own flour, milking the cow, if you're fortunate enough to have one, churning butter, preserving seasonal foods, and cooking everything from scratch over an open hearth. Hope you don't mind smoke-filled lungs and the occasional third-degree burn. The medieval woman's toolkit included extensive knowledge of herbs and plants for cooking, cleaning, and medicine, skills passed down through generations of women, but also the same knowledge that could get you accused of witchcraft if your neighbor's cow suddenly stopped giving milk. Speaking of witchcraft, let's talk about medieval medicine and your overall health prospects as a woman in this delightful era. Remember when you complained about waiting 20 minutes to see your doctor? Well, congratulations. You now have access to medical care that makes no medical care seem like a better option. Medieval physicians, if you could even access one, spoiler alert, as a woman, probably not, base their practice on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Feeling unwell? It's clearly an imbalance in your humors, and the solution is usually bloodletting. Nothing fixes a headache like draining a pint of blood from an already anemic body. And don't forget the leeches, nature's most disgusting band-aid. Women's health was particularly fascinating in medieval times, and by fascinating, I mean horrifically misunderstood. Menstruation was considered both dangerous and mysterious. Your monthly period was thought to be capable of withering crops, souring wine, rusting iron, and driving dogs mad. Medieval medical texts described menstrual blood as a poisonous waste product that could potentially kill a man if he had sexual contact with a menstruating woman. Pregnancy and childbirth were equally perilous adventures. With no prenatal care, no understanding of sterile procedures, and a general belief that pain in childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's sin, you had about a 1 in 3 chance of dying during your reproductive years. The typical woman who survived childhood could expect to be pregnant or breastfeeding for most of her adult life until menopause, if she lived that long. Your mental health wasn't faring any better in medieval understanding. Feeling depressed? You're not experiencing a chemical imbalance in your brain. You're possessed by demons. Or perhaps you have wandering womb syndrome, a diagnosis that persisted from ancient times through the medieval period. Physicians genuinely believed that your uterus could detach itself and wander around your body, causing all sorts of problems including, but not limited to, hysteria, melancholy, and erratic behavior. The recommended treatments range from the benign, pleasant smells placed near the vagina to lure the womb back to its proper location, to the horrifying, forced marriage and pregnancy to settle the wandering organ. Single women were particularly suspect, as regular sexual activity within marriage was considered essential for female health. In other words, your prescription for depression would be find a husband. Personal hygiene took on a whole new meaning in medieval times, mainly because it barely existed. Public bathhouses were common in the early medieval period, inherited from Roman culture, but they fell out of favor by the later Middle Ages due to concerns about morality and disease transmission. By the 14th century, medical authorities were warning against bathing too frequently, as they believed it opened the skin's pores and allowed disease to enter the body. Some people went their entire lives without a proper bath. The average peasant woman might wash her face and hands daily, but a full body wash? Maybe a few times a year, if that. Deodorant wasn't a thing, so everyone just marinated in their own juices. The solution to body odor was perfume for the wealthy or strong-smelling herbs tucked into clothing for everyone else. Imagine a hot summer day in a crowded marketplace, where everyone's wearing wool clothing that hasn't been washed in months. Delightful. Let's talk about your legal rights, or more accurately, your lack thereof. As a medieval woman, you existed primarily as a legal extension of your male relatives. First your father, then your husband. The concept of femme covert in medieval law meant that upon marriage, your legal identity was essentially absorbed by your husband. You couldn't own property independently, sign contracts, or represent yourself in court. Your primary legal value was reproductive, providing legitimate heirs to inherit property. Rape was prosecuted primarily as a property crime against your male guardian, rather than as a violation of your bodily autonomy. In many regions, wife beating was explicitly permitted by law as long as the rod used was no thicker than a man's thumb. That's literally where the rule of thumb phrase comes from. Some scholars dispute this etymology, but regardless, domestic violence was widely accepted as a husband's prerogative in maintaining household discipline. Your educational opportunities were similarly limited, especially if you weren't from the nobility. Basic literacy was uncommon even among men, but for women, it was exceptionally rare. Noble girls might learn to read, primarily religious texts, and manage household accounts, but advanced education was generally considered unnecessary and potentially dangerous for the female mind. The The prevailing attitude was captured by theologian Thomas Aquinas, who described women as defective and misbegotten, intellectually inferior to men and prone to being led astray by their emotions. If you showed too much intellectual curiosity or expertise in subjects like astronomy or mathematics, you risked being viewed with suspicion. The medieval church, which controlled most formal education, was particularly concerned about educated women, as female literacy could lead to dangerous ideas like interpreting religious texts independently rather than accepting male clerical authority. Some exceptional women did manage to become scholars, physicians, or writers, but they were swimming against a powerful current of institutionalized misogyny. Your career options as a medieval woman were about as varied as the breakfast menu at a prison cafeteria. While modern women agonize over whether to pursue medicine, law, or tech, you get to choose between spinning wool, brewing ale, or if you're feeling particularly ambitious, midwifery. The medieval economy operated on strict gender divisions, with women generally confined to domestic production and certain specific trades. Textile work was predominantly female. Spinning was so associated with women that unmarried women were literally called spinsters. The distaff, a tool used in spinning, became a symbol for the female side of a family. Weaving, on the other hand, gradually shifted from women's work to men's as the commercial value of textiles increased. Funny how tasks magically become men's work once they start generating significant income. The guilds that controlled most urban trades were predominantly male institutions that actively worked to exclude women. Though some widows were allowed to continue their husbands' businesses, they were generally barred from taking on apprentices or participating fully in guild governance. Even in trades where women were active participants, such as brewing or silk making, they often found themselves pushed to the margins as these crafts became more profitable and prestigious. By the late medieval period, women who had once dominated the brewing industry were being edged out by male brewers who could access the capital needed for larger operations. The pattern repeats throughout history. Women pioneer an industry. Men notice it's profitable. Women get pushed out. Some things never change. Medieval tech bros were just wearing different outfits. If you were a peasant woman, your workday would be an exhausting blur of agricultural labor combined with domestic responsibilities. Forget the romanticized image of the medieval lady embroidering by the window. Peasant women worked the fields alongside men, often while pregnant or wearing an infant strapped to their back. During harvest season, everyone worked from sunrise to sunset, gathering crops before they could spoil. Women were typically responsible for tasks like gleaning, collecting leftover grain after harvest, dairy production, caring for smaller livestock like chickens and pigs, and maintaining vegetable gardens. These contributions were essential to family survival, but often less visible and valued than men's work. Agricultural manuals and artwork from the period show women engaged in virtually every aspect of farming except plowing, which was considered too physically demanding, or perhaps too symbolically linked to male virility. For urban women, working in a family business was common, though their contributions often went unrecorded in official documents. A craftsman's wife typically worked alongside her husband, managing aspects of the business like dealing with customers, keeping accounts, and supervising apprentices, in addition to her domestic responsibilities. Widows sometimes inherited these businesses, but faced significant obstacles in maintaining them without male protection. Some trades were specifically associated with women, including silkworking, laundering, and small-scale retail. Food production and sales were also common female occupations. You might be a baker, a brewer, or run a small tavern. The medieval marketplace was full of women selling everything from pies to candles, though they typically dealt in smaller quantities and earned less than their male counterparts. One surprisingly viable career option for a medieval woman was becoming a nun, though not necessarily out of religious devotion. Convents offer an alternative to marriage and motherhood, and for some women, particularly those from noble families who couldn't arrange suitable marriages for all their daughters, they provided rare access to education and a degree of autonomy unknown to most laywomen. As a nun, you could potentially learn to read and write, study religious texts, produce manuscripts, and even hold administrative positions within the convent. Some abbesses wielded considerable power, managing large estates and engaging in political affairs. Of course, this path required taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, so it wasn't exactly joining a feminist collective. Plus, many convents required substantial dowries upon entry, making this escape hatch available primarily to women from wealthy families. If traditional occupations didn't appeal to you, there was always the world's oldest profession. Prostitution was widespread in medieval towns and cities, despite official condemnation by church authorities. Some municipalities actually regulated and taxed prostitution, viewing it as a necessary evil that could channel male sexual energy away from respectable women. In many European cities, prostitutes were required to wear distinctive clothing or badges to mark their status, the medieval equivalent of a scarlet letter. While prostitution offered a means of independent survival for women without family support, it came with significant risks, including violence, disease, and social ostracism. The life expectancy of medieval prostitutes was particularly grim, with many dying from sexually transmitted infections, complications from abortions, or violence. As with many aspects of medieval life, religious attitudes were complex. Prostitutes were condemned as sinners, yet simultaneously considered less blameworthy than the respectable women who might lead men astray through seduction and temptation. Let's talk about your love life, or more accurately, your arranged marriage to a man twice your age whom you've met exactly once before your wedding day. Romance in medieval times had about as much to do with love as modern Instagram relationships have to do with reality. Marriage was primarily an economic and political arrangement, particularly for the nobility. Your father would negotiate your marriage contract with the same enthusiasm and tactical planning he'd use for purchasing a prize cow at the market. Factors like family alliances, property exchanges, and political advantages far outweighed trivial concerns such as your personal preferences or happiness. If you were lucky, you might be consulted about the match. If you were unlucky, and most were, you discover your future husband's identity when the arrangements were already finalized. The typical age for marriage varied by social class and region, but girls from noble families could be betrothed as young as 7, though the marriage wouldn't be consummated until they reached puberty. Small mercies. Peasant women typically married in their late teens or early 20s, often after accumulating enough resources to establish a household. Your consent to marriage was technically required by church law, but consent had a flexible definition when you were raised from birth to understand that your primary value lay in making an advantageous match. Refusing a marriage arranged by your family could result in being disowned, sent to a convent, or subjected to physical coercion. The romantic notion of marrying for love was primarily a literary concept, appearing in courtly romances that were popular among the nobility but had little relation to actual marriage practices. These tales of knights pining for unattainable ladies made for great entertainment precisely because they were fantasy, not social reality. Once married, your primary duty was clear: produce heirs, preferably male ones. Medieval understanding of reproduction placed the burden of fertility entirely on women. If a couple remained childless, it was assumed to be the wife's fault. Medical treatments for barrenness range from the harmless, special diets and herbal concoctions, to the bizarre, sitting over pots of steaming herbs to open the womb, to the dangerous, various potions containing toxic ingredients. The pressure to produce sons was particularly intense for noble women, whose primary function was to ensure the continuity of their husband's lineage. King Henry VIII's notorious marital history wasn't unusual in its motivation, only in the extreme measures he took to solve his heir problem. For peasant families, children of either sex were valuable as additional laborers. Those sons were still preferred for their ability to perform certain agricultural tasks and to carry on the family name. The medieval bedroom would make modern sex therapists weep with despair. Church teachings severely restricted when and how married couples could engage in sexual activity. Sex was forbidden on Sundays, Wednesdays, and Fridays for religious observance, during Lent and Advent, during menstruation, during pregnancy, and for 40 days after childbirth. When you tally it all up, married couples were expected to abstain from sex for roughly half the year. The only legitimate position was what we now call missionary, as other positions were considered unnatural and potentially sinful. Foreplay was discouraged as too pleasurable, and female sexual pleasure was largely irrelevant or actively suspicious. Medieval medical authorities believed that female orgasm was necessary for conception, one of the few beliefs that actually worked in women's favor. But they also warned that excessive female pleasure could produce female rather than male children, a clear incentive to keep things brief and businesslike. Contraception existed, but was officially condemned by the church, placing women in an impossible position, expected to fulfill their marital duty while simultaneously discouraged from taking measures to limit the potentially deadly consequences of repeated pregnancies. Folk methods of birth control included herbal preparations, some actually effective, others not, primitive barriers made from beeswax, and various magical practices of dubious efficacy. More reliable was extended breastfeeding, which somewhat reduced fertility, though certainly not to the level of modern contraceptives. Abortion, while practiced secretly, carried severe penalties if discovered, not to mention significant health risks from dangerous procedures performed without medical knowledge. The combination of religious prohibition, limited effective options, and the absence of reliable sexual education meant that most women spent their reproductive years in a cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and lactation until menopause or death, whichever came first. Medieval marriages weren't exactly known for their equality, but they weren't uniformly oppressive either. The reality varied widely depending on social class, region, and individual personalities. While legal doctrines gave husbands nearly complete control over their wives, everyday practice often required more partnership than the law suggested. Peasant households functioned as economic units where both spouses' labor was essential for survival, creating a certain interdependence. Urban artisan families similarly relied on the contributions of both husband and wife to maintain their craft business. Evidence from court records shows that some medieval women actively defended their interests, sued abusive husbands, and managed household affairs with considerable autonomy. This isn't to romanticize the period. Domestic violence was common and broadly accepted, but rather to recognize that women weren't entirely without agency, even within highly restrictive social structures. As with many aspects of medieval life, the gap between official doctrine and everyday practice created spaces where women could exercise limited forms of power and autonomy. If you've made it this far without dying of plague, childbirth complications, or being burned as a witch, congratulations. You're outperforming most of your medieval peers. Speaking of which, let's discuss your social life, which was about as vibrant and diverse as a North Korean election ballot. Your social circle was determined almost entirely by your husband's status, your family connections, and your immediate geographic community. The modern concept of networking or forming friendships based on common interests would seem utterly foreign. Your relationships were largely predetermined by the rigid social hierarchy that organized every aspect of medieval life. The people you interacted with regularly were those you worked alongside, worshipped with, or were related to, a social pool about as expansive as a puddle in the Sahara. For peasant women, social interactions centered around communal labor and religious observances. Village life created tight-knit communities where privacy was virtually non-existent. Imagine living your entire life on a reality show without the cash prize or Instagram sponsorships. Communal activities like bread baking, laundering at streams, or harvesting created opportunities for women to gather and exchange news, advice, and gossip. These informal networks served as crucial support systems, particularly during childbirth or illness when women relied on female neighbors and relatives for assistance. Village social dynamics could be supportive but also suffocating. Any behavior that deviated from community norms risked gossip, ostracism, or worse. That quirky individualism that makes you so unique on your dating profile would have marked you as dangerously eccentric in a medieval context. Conformity wasn't just socially encouraged. It was essential for survival in communities where mutual cooperation determined whether everyone ate or starved. Religious festivals provided rare opportunities for recreation and socializing beyond daily work. The medieval calendar was punctuated by numerous holy days, far more than our modern handful of statutory holidays. These religious celebrations combined sacred observances with communal feasting, dancing, games, and performances. For women whose movements were otherwise restricted, These festivals offered precious chances to enjoy music, dancing, and a brief respite from constant labor. Parish churches served as community centers where women gathered, not just for worship, but also for social connections. Churchyards were sites for markets, games, and gatherings. The medieval equivalent of your local mall, minus the food court and overpriced athleisure stores. Religious confraternities and parish guilds provided additional social structures where women could participate in community life, though typically in gender-specific roles focused on charity, caring for church linens, or maintaining shrines. Urban women enjoyed somewhat broader social opportunities than their rural counterparts, particularly those involved in trade. Marketplaces were predominantly female spaces where women sold goods, exchanged information, and formed business connections. Female vendors developed networks based on commercial relationships, creating a parallel social world that operated alongside the male-dominated political sphere. Alehouses, often run by women, functioned as community gathering spots where gender boundaries were somewhat relaxed. Though medieval society maintained strict ideas about female propriety, working women necessarily moved through public spaces with greater freedom than aristocratic ladies, whose movements and interactions were more tightly controlled. This mobility came at a cost. However, women in public were vulnerable to harassment, assault, and damage to their reputation. The medieval double standard meant that a woman's presence in public spaces always carried risks to her perceived honor that men simply didn't face. For noble women, social life was paradoxically both more restricted and more elaborate. Highborn ladies were closely supervised, with their movements and interactions carefully monitored to protect their virtue, and by extension, their marriageability and family honor. Yet they also participated in sophisticated court culture, entertainment, and ceremonial occasions impossible for commoners to access. Noble households were public spaces where political relationships were formed and maintained through hospitality and display. As the lady of such a household, you would be responsible for managing elaborate social events, overseeing entertainment, and maintaining the network of relationships that supported your family's position. Your performance in these social duties directly impacted your husband's political standing and your family's prosperity. Think of it as being a corporate wife, Renaissance Fair edition. Your social graces weren't just personal accomplishments, but professional skills essential to your family's advancement. Female friendships provided vital emotional support in a world where marriages were strategic rather than romantic. Letters between medieval women revealed deep bonds of affection and loyalty that sustained them through the hardships of pre-modern life. These same-sex friendships often proved more stable and nurturing than marital relationships, creating spaces where women could express themselves more freely. Mothers and daughters, sisters, female cousins, and friends formed support networks that shared practical knowledge about childbirth, healing, household management, and survival strategies within patriarchal structures. These relationships transmitted not just practical skills, but also emotional wisdom and coping mechanisms across generations of women. The modern notion of girl power might be anachronistic, but medieval women absolutely understood the importance of female solidarity in navigating a world designed by and for men. Your Instagram girl gang has nothing on the survival-based alliances medieval women formed to protect each other in a world where they had few legal rights and little formal authority. Let's talk about your leisure time. That precious 2 minutes between finishing your 14 hours of backbreaking labor and collapsing onto your flea-infested straw mattress. Medieval entertainment didn't include Netflix binges or scrolling through TikTok until your eyes bleed. Instead, you had storytelling, music, dancing, and various games that range from the familiar, chess, dice, to the bizarre, early versions of football that more closely resembled village-wide riots than organized sports. Entertainment was communal rather than individual, and usually combined with practical activities. Women often sang while spinning or weaving, turning monotonous labor into something slightly less soul-crushing. Imagine your modern book club, except everyone's simultaneously mending clothes, nursing babies, and preparing food while discussing the latest body tale rather than sipping wine and pretending to have read this month's selection. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people did have a sense of humor. Though it might strike modern sensibilities as crude, often revolving around bodily functions, cuckolded husbands, and corrupt clergy. Peasant humor was particularly physical and ribald. Fart jokes have apparently been hilarious for millennia. Women's humor often targeted the absurdities of male authority and the contradictions of their restricted social position. The tales of the Wife of Bath and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales reflect this tradition of female subversive comedy that used wit to challenge patriarchal assumptions. Laughter served as both entertainment and coping mechanism in a world where life was precarious and often brutal. Medieval festivals frequently incorporated ritual inversion and licensed misrule, where normal social hierarchies were temporarily suspended or reversed. These carnivalesque occasions provided rare opportunities for women to mock male authority figures or participate in normally forbidden behaviors. Medieval versions of What Happens in Vegas Stays in Vegas, except with more plague and less neon. For noble women, hunting with falcons or small dogs provided one of the few acceptable outdoor recreational activities, unlike the mounted pursuit of deer or boar reserved for men. Falconry was considered appropriately feminine, while still allowing aristocratic women to display their status through the expensive birds they commanded. Other elite pastimes included playing musical instruments, the lute or harp being particularly fashionable, embroidery, dancing, and chess, all activities that demonstrated the refined sensibilities expected of ladies while keeping them safely indoors and visible. Medieval romance literature was particularly popular among noble women, offering escapist fantasies of passionate love and adventure that contrasted sharply with the pragmatic reality of arranged marriages. These tales, while reinforcing conventional gender roles in many ways, also featured active heroines and explored female desire in ways that must have resonated with women whose own romantic choices were severely limited. Religious devotion occupied much of what we might now consider leisure time, though medieval people wouldn't have made such a distinction between spiritual practice and recreation. Prayer wasn't just a Sunday morning obligation, but woven throughout daily life. Women's religious practice often centered around household devotions, where mothers led children in prayers and taught religious stories. More elaborate forms of female piety included pilgrimages to holy sites, one of the few socially acceptable reasons for women to travel independently, veneration of saints, particularly female saints, and mystical practices. By the later Middle Ages, affective piety, forms of devotion emphasizing emotional connection to Christ's suffering, became particularly associated with women. Female mystics like Julian of Norwich and Margery Kempe described intense visionary experiences that gave them spiritual authority in a world that otherwise limited female voices. These women's religious writings created spaces for female expression and influence within the constraints of medieval Christianity. Board games and gambling were surprisingly popular across all social classes, though moralists regularly condemned them as sinful distractions. Archaeological finds include numerous dice, game boards, and playing pieces from medieval households at various social levels. Chess was particularly esteemed for its strategic elements, and by the late medieval period, playing cards had begun to spread throughout Europe. These games weren't just idle amusements, but carried social significance. Skill at chess marked one as intellectually accomplished, while gambling games created bonds through shared risk and excitement. Women participated in these pastimes despite occasional disapproval from religious authorities who worried that games might lead to idleness, gambling addiction, or inappropriate mixing of the sexes. Medieval illustrations show women playing chess, backgammon, and various dice games, sometimes in mixed gender groups. Gambling offered rare opportunities for women to engage in competitive activities with men on relatively equal terms, though high-stakes betting remained primarily a male activity. Festivals and holidays punctuated the agricultural year, providing essential breaks from routine labor. These celebrations combined religious observance with communal feasting, dancing, games, and performances. Spring festivals celebrated renewal and fertility with maypole dancing and the selection of May Queens, young women temporarily elevated to symbolic positions of honor. Harvest festivals marked the successful completion of the agricultural cycle with excessive food and drink that helped communities face the coming winter. Christmas celebrations lasted 12 days and featured role reversal, misrule, and communal singing. For women, These festivals offered rare public platforms, as May Queens, as participants in dance and song, or as organizers of communal feasts. The preparation of special foods for these occasions fell primarily to women, making their culinary expertise central to successful celebrations. While modern holidays involve posting carefully curated family photos on Instagram, medieval festivals were genuinely communal events that strengthened social bonds essential for survival. Your contribution to the village feast wasn't optional. Your neighbors remembered who shared generously and who hoarded resources when winter shortages arrived. Religion wasn't just part of medieval life. It was the framework through which everything else was understood and experienced. As a woman, your relationship with the church was complicated to say the least. On one hand, Christianity offered theological equality, with early church fathers like Augustine acknowledging that women possessed immortal souls equal to men's in spiritual potential. On the other hand, religious teachings emphasized women's subordination, using Eve's creation from Adam's rib and her role in the fall as justification for female inferiority. You were simultaneously the vessel of original sin and potential redemption, a Madonna whore complex written into theological doctrine. The parish church stood at the center of community life, and women were among its most devoted participants. You'd attend Mass regularly, observe religious feast days, and participate in processions and communal prayers. Despite your active participation, you were barred from religious leadership. No priesthood for you, regardless of your devotion or knowledge. The church viewed women as spiritually weaker and more susceptible to sin than men, requiring male guidance and supervision. This didn't stop women from finding alternative routes to religious expression and authority, particularly through mysticism, where direct communication with the divine bypassed male, institutional gatekeepers. Medieval women's religious experiences varied dramatically across social classes. For peasant women, devotion was practical and immediate, praying for good harvests, healthy children, and protection from disease. Your religious practice would focus on saints associated with childbirth, healing, and household protection. You might keep small shrines in your home, where protective amulets, officially discouraged but widely practiced, or make offerings at holy wells. Many of these practices combine Christian elements with older folk traditions, creating a practical spirituality focused on managing life's dangers rather than abstract theology. For noble women, religious patronage offered one of the few socially acceptable avenues for exercising public influence. You might commission religious artwork, donate to monasteries, or even found religious institutions. These acts of piety demonstrated your virtue while allowing you to direct significant resources and shape religious culture. Private devotion became increasingly important for elite women, who often possessed beautifully illustrated books of hours containing prayers for different times of day. These personalized prayer books, frequently passed from mother to daughter, created spaces for female spiritual autonomy within the constraints of orthodox practice. The veneration of female saints provided models of feminine virtue beyond motherhood and obedience. Saints like Catherine of Alexandria, a learned woman who defeated male philosophers in debate, or Margaret of Antioch, who survived being swallowed by a dragon, represented female courage, wisdom, and power. Women particularly sought the intercession of the Virgin Mary, whose status as Mother of God elevated motherhood, while her perpetual virginity paradoxically reinforced the idea that female sexuality was problematic. Mary represented an impossible ideal, simultaneously virgin and mother, that real women could never achieve, but were nonetheless encouraged to emulate. While official church teaching emphasized women's spiritual equality but practical subordination, actual religious practice created spaces where women exercised surprising levels of autonomy and authority. Female mystics claimed direct access to divine wisdom, often describing intensely physical experiences of union with Christ that bypassed clerical mediation. Women like Hildegard of Bingen combined mystical visions with practical leadership, founding religious communities and producing theological works. Beguines, lay religious women who lived in semi-monastic communities without taking permanent vows, created independent female spiritual spaces outside both marriage and traditional convents. The Church's relationship with these expressions of female religiosity was ambivalent at best, sometimes celebrating them as examples of extraordinary piety, sometimes condemning them as dangerous or heretical. Your political power as a medieval woman existed somewhere between virtually none and only through extremely creative maneuvering. The public political sphere was almost exclusively male territory, with formal positions of authority, from village headman to king, reserved for men. Women were explicitly excluded from voting, holding office, or participating directly in government at any level. This exclusion was justified through natural law arguments that women were intellectually and emotionally unsuited for public responsibilities. Aristotle's influential view that women were deformed males provided philosophical backing for keeping you away from any meaningful decision-making. Despite these formal restrictions, elite women sometimes exercised significant political influence through informal channels. As a noblewoman married to a powerful lord, you might act as his representative during his absence, manage his correspondence, or influence his decisions through private counsel. Queens and noble ladies often served as intercessors, appealing to their husbands for mercy on behalf of others, thereby shaping the application of justice while reinforcing gender roles that cast women as emotional and compassionate counterweights to male authority. This intercession role allowed women to participate in politics while maintaining the fiction that they remained properly removed from power. Queenship represented the highest form of female political authority, though its nature varied significantly across regions and time periods. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of Castile, and Blanche of Castile all exercised substantial power, though typically as regents for underage sons rather than in their own right. Queens were expected to produce heirs, their primary function, manage royal households, participate in ceremonial roles, and use family connections to facilitate diplomatic relations. A queen's influence depended largely on her relationship with her husband, her family connections, and her personal political skills. The most successful royal women developed networks of supporters, leveraged control over patronage, and cultivated public images that balanced authority with appropriate femininity. Marriage alliances constituted a form of female political participation, with noble women serving as living treaties between families or kingdoms. Your primary political value might be as a connection between male power structures rather than as a political actor in your own right. This instrumental view of elite women didn't prevent some from actively cultivating these connections to build their own influence. Strategic marriages allowed women to serve as cultural ambassadors, bringing new ideas, artistic styles, and court practices across borders. Many introduced innovations from their home courts, influencing everything from fashion to administrative techniques in their new domains. At lower social levels, women participated in local politics through less formal channels. Town records show women petitioning authorities, testifying in court cases, and participating in guild governance in limited capacities. Widows in particular could sometimes exercise rights normally reserved for men, including property management and business leadership. In peasant communities, older women often wielded considerable informal authority based on their knowledge of local history, customs, and relationships. While these forms of influence rarely appear in official political histories, they shaped everyday governance and community decision-making in significant ways. The most dramatic form of female political action came through organized protests over food prices and availability. Women led many of the food riots that erupted during shortages, drawing on their authority as household providers responsible for feeding families. These collective actions operated within the moral economy framework, the shared belief that communities had rights to subsistence that overrode market principles during crises. By defending traditional fair prices and access to necessities, women could legitimately enter public space and make political demands without directly challenging gender hierarchies. While modern protesters might post manifestos on social media, medieval women used their bodies and voices to physically occupy marketplaces and force authorities to address their concerns about survival itself. Let's discuss your intellectual life in the Middle Ages, or what passed for one in an era when female education ranged from minimal to non-existent. If you were born into a peasant family, your education would consist primarily of practical skills transmitted orally. Household management, agricultural techniques, food preservation, basic religious knowledge, and folk medicine. Formal literacy would be about as accessible to you as a SpaceX rocket launch is to the average modern factory worker. The ability to read and write was largely confined to the clergy and nobility, with women consistently having lower literacy rates than men of comparable social status. Learning your letters simply wasn't considered necessary or appropriate for most female roles. Even for noble women, education focused primarily on skills necessary for managing households and displaying appropriate refinement. You might learn to read, particularly devotional texts, perhaps write, play musical instruments, dance, embroider, and speak enough French to participate in courtly culture. Your brothers, meanwhile, would study Latin, rhetoric, mathematics, and other subjects considered essential for participation in public life. The gender nature of medieval education reflected and reinforced the separate spheres ideology that confined women to domestic and reproductive roles. Your intellectual development was valued primarily for how it contributed to your marriageability and ability to raise children properly, not for any intrinsic worth or potential for broader contribution. The medieval university system, which began developing in the 12th century at institutions like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, explicitly excluded women. These centers of learning, originally formed to train clergy, remained all-male institutions dedicated to theology, law, medicine, and the liberal arts. Women seeking advanced knowledge had to find alternative pathways, usually through religious communities. Convents offer the most significant opportunities for female intellectual development, with some becoming important centers of learning and manuscript production. As a nun, you might access libraries, study theology and languages, and even produce original works, though still within carefully prescribed boundaries that rarely challenged male authority directly. Despite these structural barriers, exceptional women managed to acquire significant learning and produce important intellectual and creative works. Christine de Pizan, often considered Europe's first professional female author, wrote poetry, political treatises, and feminist works like the Book of the City of Ladies, which directly challenged misogynistic traditions. Hildegard of Bingen composed music, wrote on medicine and natural science, and created an invented language, all while serving as an abbess. These women represent rare exceptions rather than the rule, achieving intellectual distinction despite systemic obstacles rather than because of supportive educational structures. Medieval attitudes toward female intellectual capacity were deeply contradictory. Religious texts acknowledged women's spiritual equality while emphasizing their practical subordination. Medical theories based on Galenic humoral systems characterized women as cold and wet compared to men's hot and dry nature, making them physically and intellectually inferior, but also more compassionate and nurturing. The influential philosopher Thomas Aquinas described women as misbegotten males with weaker reasoning abilities, requiring male guidance. These views weren't merely abstract philosophy, but shaped concrete educational opportunities and legal structures that limited female intellectual development and expression. The transmission of practical knowledge between women created parallel intellectual traditions outside formal educational systems. Mothers taught daughters essential skills in household management, herbal medicine, midwifery, textile production, and food preservation. This knowledge, while rarely written down or formally recognized, represented sophisticated understanding of natural processes, material properties, and human biology. The medieval stereotype of the wise woman or cunning woman acknowledged this female knowledge tradition while simultaneously rendering it suspicious. The same herbal knowledge that made you a valued healer could, if authorities became hostile, transform you into a suspected witch. Your intellectual life existed in this precarious space, essential for community survival, yet potentially dangerous if it appeared to challenge male authority or orthodox religion. Congratulations! You survived our medieval simulation without dying from plague, childbirth complications, or being accused of witchcraft for knowing basic herbal remedies. Let's reflect on how your medieval existence compares to your modern life, shall we? Today, you might complain about the gender pay gap or the glass ceiling, but at least your basic humanity isn't legally questionable. Modern women have gradually gained rights medieval women couldn't imagine. Voting, property ownership, educational access, career choices, and reproductive control. The transformation from being legally classified as property to being recognized as full citizens represents perhaps the most significant social revolution in human history. Though the fact that it took until the 20th century for most women to gain basic political rights suggests how deeply entrenched patriarchal systems were. Your bodily autonomy has undergone a particularly dramatic evolution. Medieval women had virtually no control over their reproductive lives, with church teachings, limited contraceptive options, and social expectations conspiring to keep them in a constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth. Modern reproductive technologies, legal protections, and changing social attitudes have transformed this fundamental aspect of female experience. The average modern woman in developed countries can expect to have 2 children rather than 8 to 10 pregnancies, and maternal mortality has plummeted from about 1 death per 100 births to fewer than 20 per 100,000 in developed countries. These statistics represent millions of women's lives saved and fundamentally altered life trajectories. Your working life has similarly transformed, though with more complex and contradictory patterns. Medieval women worked constantly, combining domestic labor with agricultural or commercial activities essential to family survival. Modern women still face the second shift phenomenon, bearing disproportionate responsibility for housework and childcare, even while working outside the home. The difference is that your labor is now more likely to be compensated directly rather than subsumed into family economics, giving you greater independence. Career options have expanded dramatically, from a handful of gender-appropriate trades to virtually every profession, at least theoretically. Yet occupational segregation persists, with certain fields remaining predominantly male or female, and the most prestigious and lucrative careers still disproportionately occupied by men. Educational opportunities represent perhaps the most complete revolution in women's status. From near-universal female illiteracy and exclusion from formal education, we've moved to a world where women outnumber men in university enrollment in many countries. The medieval belief in women's intellectual inferiority has been thoroughly debunked by women's achievements in every academic field, though subtle biases persist in how female intellectual contributions are valued and recognized. This educational transformation has created cascading effects through every aspect of women's lives, enabling economic independence, political participation, and cultural influence unimaginable to your medieval counterpart. The ability to read widely, think critically, and communicate ideas remains the foundation for women's continued advancement and resistance to remaining inequalities. Religious and philosophical frameworks for understanding gender have undergone their own evolution, though with significant continuities. Many major religions still maintain male leadership and theological traditions that emphasize gender complementarity rather than equality. Yet feminist theology has challenged traditional interpretations, reclaiming female religious figures and developing more egalitarian readings of sacred texts. The medieval view of women as spiritually equal but functionally subordinate has gradually given way to more comprehensive equality concepts, though conservative religious movements continue to promote separate gender roles based on essentially medieval understandings of natural order. The theological debates that medieval scholars engaged in about women's nature and proper role continue today in different forms, demonstrating how deeply religious concepts shaped gender ideologies that persist even in secular contexts. So would you survive a day as a medieval woman? Physically, probably, though the odds wouldn't be in your favor over the long term. Psychologically, the adjustment from modern autonomy to medieval restrictions would likely prove more challenging than the physical hardships. The most difficult aspect might be accepting a worldview that fundamentally questioned your intellectual capacity, moral strength, and fitness for independence. Medieval women didn't experience their lives as oppressive in the way modern women would, because they operated within a coherent, if limiting cosmology that explained their subordination as natural and divinely ordained. The greatest privilege of modern women may be the conceptual frameworks that allow us to imagine and demand equality rather than accept hierarchy as inevitable. So the next time you're frustrated by persistent gender inequalities, Remember that the very ability to recognize them as unjust rather than natural represents historical progress worth celebrating. Right before you get back to the ongoing work of creating a truly equal society.